Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started in a few minutes as folks are logging in. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much to the folks who are joining us. I do want to do, before we get started, for those who want to participate in the Zoom meeting with a language interpretation, you can locate the interpretation button. It's a globe icon in your Zoom controls. And then you will hear the meeting audio in Spanish. And the original audio will be of a lower volume. We also have sign language interpretation that we have available as well. I will go ahead and repeat this message in Spanish. Si requiere interpretación de español, pueden buscar el icono del mundo en el control de Zoom para escoger su lenguaje y pueden escuchar la junta en español. Y el volumen original o el mensaje original va a estar un poquito más bajo. If you have trouble, with the Spanish, if you can go ahead and send us a message to let us know. Si tiene, and I will go ahead and repeat this message in Spanish. Si tiene problemas en encontrar el intérprete, mándenos un mensaje y le ayudaremos. All right, we will go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Let me go ahead and make sure that all of our tech check. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you and welcome. My name is Isis Lopez, and I am the Engagement Manager for Development Services Department, a department with the City of Austin. Thank you so much for joining us in what we call the DSC Info Series. It is just a little bit of background on that. Our DSC Info Series is a series of community-focused educational information that we're offering in person, in Spanish, and in several languages. And it's all about our services, our programs, and different guidance from our experts. The very first one that we talked about like if you don't know where to start, where to start. We introduced our development process team, and we also introduced our neighborhood assistance center. And today we're going to be talking about building under home. We have guidance from experts to talk about this. We had a session last week that talked about home phase 1, and that will be available online. All of our past sessions and recordings are available in our website. It is publicinput.com/DSC info series. We'll go ahead and share that link to folks if you want to check them out. You can also check out future sessions, again, at publicinput.com at DSC info series to take a look at the ones that are coming up. We'll have folks, the next one that's coming up this Saturday will be in person, and we'll have folks from Code Compliance talk about spring cleaning and the different property maintenance tips that they have. All right. Today's session, we are going to be talking about building under home and specifically focus for tiny homes and understanding the technical requirements for tiny homes. We have one subject matter expert here who is going to be presenting. His name is John Bowman, and he is our plans examiner with the DSC department. But we also have several other departments and several other experts in the room. We have folks from Austin Water and from Austin Energy and from several other areas in development services available to answer questions. Next slide, please. All right, before we get started, before John starts talking about all of the technical requirements and all the information available for tiny homes and building under homes, I just want to overview the format for today's session. We will have a presentation from John who will overview the information, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers at the end. And so you can ask the questions. There's two ways that you can participate. You can raise your hand using the raise hand function on the control panel. Or you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Again, if you have trouble locating the Q&A function, let us know, send us a message, and we'll help troubleshoot for you. And then we will alternate back and forth. I'll note that this meeting is being recorded and will be available not only for folks who registered and who participate, but also online in our publicinfo.com/CSD info series. We'll have a copy of the recording and a copy of the presentation available for you. And then while we hope to answer all of the questions that you might have, we might not have enough time for them or enough information, but we will make note of them if you go ahead and add them to the Q&A session. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to John, who will go ahead and get us started with the information. John?
Thank you, Isis. My name is John Bowman, and I am the Technical Residential Plans Examiner Supervisor here at DSD. And today we'll be talking about tiny homes and specifically and how they're related to the home amendment or ordinances. Home is a series of updates to the Land Development Code here at the City of Austin, which I'll shorten to LDC as we go along, which governs land use regulations, dictating what can be built, where it can be built, and how much can be built. It's undergone numerous amendments since its adoption in the mid-'80s, responding to different policy changes and goals. Next slide, please. So a little history on home. It stands for Home Options for Mobility and Equity, or it's also known as Austin's Home Options for Middle Income Empowerment. In July of 2023, City Council passed a resolution to facilitate the availability of smaller, more diverse home housing options and to allow more housing units on a single family lot. Home focuses on the creation of infill development options for those single family neighborhoods. The goal of these changes is to provide more housing types and increase the housing supply within those zoned areas, and specifically targets lower and middle income homeowners and landowners. Next slide. So here's a timeline of the home amendments so far. On December 7th of 2023, phase 1 was adopted by City Council, and those changes went into effect on February 5th. Then phase 2 was adopted on May 16th of 2024, and those went into effect in August. Side note, in July, we're going to be adopting the 2024 International Residential Code, which will cover a lot of things that I'm going to be speaking on today. And it'll remove some requirements from the process that I'll mention later on. The next slide. Here's some helpful terms to know, and I'll be going through their definitions as we move along. So there's tiny homes, there's dwelling units, mobile homes, manufactured homes, modular homes, and recreational vehicles. Next slide. So what is a tiny home? A tiny home is a dwelling unit that is 400 square feet or less in floor area, excluding loft space. And the IRC, or International Residential Code, defines a loft as a floor level located more than 30 inches above the main floor on one or more sides with a ceiling height of less than 6'8" to be used as living or sleeping area. Next slide. So what is a dwelling unit? Dwelling unit is a residential unit other than a mobile home, providing complete independent living facilities, including permanent provisions for living, sleeping, eating, and cooking. So this is either a separate area or an entirely different structure that somebody can live in exclusively and independently, not needing to utilize a main house or another section of a different dwelling. Next slide. So mobile home is a movable dwelling constructed on a chassis or frame, which is typically metal, built prior to June 15th, 1976. This is designed for use without a permanent foundation and to be permanently connected to utilities. Next slide. A manufactured home is pretty much the same thing, but built after the date of June 15th, 1976. They're also built on the permanent chassis or frame and to be designed to use without a permanent foundation and also connected to the utilities. Next slide. Now, those are different than a modular home, which is all of these are built off-site. But a modular home is built in different sections or modules to be assembled on height or on site. The main difference is they're delivered on a trailer and removed and placed onto a permanent foundation, similar to what you see in the photo provided. Substantial construction usually takes place after it's placed onto the foundation to complete the structure in order to connect the modules or finish the home. The next slide, we go into recreational vehicles. It's a vehicle or trailer designed for recreational purposes and includes travel trailers, pickup campers, other camping trailers, motor coach homes, can also be converted trucks or buses, boats, and or boat trailers. These are not designed for permanent occupancy, and they're more designed for a temporary shelter for recreational activities. They're also not permanently attached to local utilities. Next, we move on to tiny homes, which a tiny home on wheels, like is pictured in the photo, is considered by the city of Austin as a recreational vehicle. They're not permitted as dwellings on residential lots. They can be placed in RV parks if they're compliant with the utility connection standards, and same for mobile home parks, as long as they comply with the city site development regulations. And these can all these regulations can be found in the land development code. It's 25-2-1205, which is site development regulations for mobile home parks. Next slide. Today I'll be speaking on the technical requirements, so the building code side of things for dwellings. And currently the city of Austin has adopted the 2021 version. The city council did adopt the 2024 version of the IRC, and those will go into effect in July of this year. There'll be minor changes, but for today, I'll be speaking on the 2021 version of it. The next slide. Here's a couple technical definitions from the IRC for requirements for tiny homes. So first is an egress roof access window, which is a skylight or roof window designed as required in R310.2, which speaks on emergency egress and rescue openings. It does have a minimum dimension of 20 inches by 24 inches at 44 inches above the finished floor. We also have landing platform, which is a landing provided at the top as the top step of a stairway to access a loft. And I'll go into detail on what's required for a landing platform in later slides. So a loft is a floor level located more than 30 inches above the main floor on one or more sides with a ceiling height of less than 6'8" to be used as living or sleeping space, as I mentioned earlier. Next slide. So as the city had adopted the 2021 IRC, but at that time we did not adopt the Appendix Q, which speaks directly on tiny homes. So you can still use those provisions spelled out in Appendix Q, but you also have to have or go through the alternative method of compliance or AMOC process to be able to utilize those regulations. As I mentioned, we have adopted the 2024 and in July, the Appendix Q will be able to be utilized without the AMOC process. So it'll simplify that process of wanting to build a tiny home. Next. So for a tiny home, we do have certain requirements. They and this does not apply to the manufactured homes or tiny home on wheels. These are strictly on-site built tiny homes. They must be installed on a permanent foundation, which would need to be engineered. And those requirements can be found in Chapter 4 of the 2021 IRC. 911 addressing is required. So if you have multiple tiny homes on a lot, each dwelling unit must have a unique address. They can also be something like unit 1, unit 2, or unit A, unit B, that sort of thing. But that just allows emergency responders to be able to go to the right dwelling if there are multiple ones on the same property. They must also be connected permanently to water, sewer, and electrical utilities. And the tiny homes also must comply with conservation requirements spelled out in AQ 106. And that's I'm not going to touch on that today, but it can be found in the IRC. Next slide. So some standards that are required for, I'd say, full-size dwellings or non-tiny homes that are different from tiny homes are here. So ceiling height is 7 feet minimum for most rooms of a house. It can go down to 6'8" for the bath and laundry. For a tiny home, those are reduced to 6'8" minimum throughout, and 6'4" for bath and laundry. And then a note, lofts have to be less than 6'8". There's also the room area dimension for a full-size dwelling. Room area can't be less than 70 square feet, and there can't be a horizontal dimension of less than 7 feet. In a tiny home, that's reduced to 35 square feet for the entire room area, and no horizontal dimension less than 5 feet. This does not apply to stairways, which I'll get in more into that here in a bit. Next slide. Talking about stairway width. For a tiny home, it's reduced from 36 inches to 17 inches, or 20 inches below the handrail. And then stairway headroom is reduced from 6'8" to 6'2" inches. And these can be found in AQ 104.2.1. And then the treads and risers for stairways, treads are a minimum of 12 inches, and then risers are a minimum of 7 inches. The next slide, going into depth on what that is. Tread depth is the horizontal distance of a step. That's called a tread. And then the height of the step is called the riser height. Those will come into play here on this next slide. Next slide. So for tiny homes, sometimes space limits how big stairways can be. And so they can't always comply with having full riser height or full riser or tread depth. So there's calculations that have been spelled out in the IRC. So if you're given a riser height, you can use a calculation of 20 inches minus 4/3 of that riser height. And then option 2, if you're given tread depth, in order to find the riser height, you do 15 inches minus 3/4 of the tread depth. The next slide, given examples. So if you have a stairwell that, or stairway that, you have to get to a certain elevation in to access a loft, and you're able to calculate that you have, 12, you can do 12-inch risers. So to find the tread depth, of those steps, it would be 20 inches from the previous, calculations. 20 inches minus 4/3 of the riser height. So it'd be 20 minus 16 inches gives you a tread depth of 4 inches, which is obviously substantially less than that typical minimum. And then same thing for if you're given tread depths, you can find the riser height. So if you're limited on how deep your stairway could be, this could be helpful. Again, it's 15 inches minus 3/4 of the tread depth of 8 inches in this case. So 15 inches minus the 6-inch from that calculation gives you a riser height of 9 inches. That's extremely complicated, but I apologize. It's, if you have further questions, I recommend that you speak with one of our technical reviewers, and they can help you walk through that process. We do have appointments available, which I believe Isis will speak on later. The next slide, I'll be talking about the landing, loft landing platform. So having a loft landing platform is required for lofts that have a ceiling height of less than 6'2". And so it allows as kind of a landing space prior to essentially crawling onto a loft. So the riser can be substantially larger than normal. So it's between 16 inches and 18 inches is allowed. And then the width and depth of that platform is a 20-inch minimum. So it's a larger top step, essentially. And it is required to have a 6'2" minimum head height. Our drawing is not to scale, I apologize, but essentially it's that, like I said, a top step that's larger than normal to allow you to be able to transition from the stairway to the loft area safely. Next slide. So there are state licensing requirements for tiny homes that are, if they are built off-site and designed to be installed on a permanent foundation, similar to a modular home. These fall under the scope of the TDLR, which is the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation, which is a statewide entity that regulates those standards. And I'll speak a little bit more on that coming up. The next slide. So industrialized housing, I'm not entirely an expert on this, but per Texas Occupation Code 1202.002, is a residential structure for one or more families, also built in modules, similar to a modular home, which is also constructed off-site and to be installed on a permanent foundation. And they are intended for permanent residential use. Next slide. So here's where the building code requirements are changing for going to the 2024 IRC. Those go into effect July 1st. That's last year. So that should have been July 5th, 2025. They'll comply with the 2024 edition of all these codes. So speaking specifically on the second bullet point, which is the IRC, like I mentioned, it'll be the 2024 edition, and it will include the appendices, specifically AQ, which speaks on tiny homes. And so that I wanted to point out that on this slide. The next, speaking on the TDLR, or Texas Department of Licensing and Regulations, they must follow the codes and appendices adopted by TDLR, which I believe they're under the 2021 also IRC, but they did adopt the AQ to be able to build these tiny homes off-site. They are required to have a TDLR insignia, which is a metal plaque on the outside, and it will have a certification number similar to a serial number. And they TDLR inspects both the manufacturing facility and the homes themselves. Any tiny homes that do not have this plaque are prohibited to be used as dwelling units in the city of Austin. And it also, TDLR does certify builders outside of the state of Texas, but the city of Austin does not allow for out of state builders to be utilized here within the city. And again, these are strictly talking about the tiny homes, not manufactured homes. Next slide. I'll turn it back over to Isis. Let her wrap it up.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sean, and thank you for all the information. We'll also be able to share some resources and links that will be helpful. We had a few folks ask about the IRC, the International Residential Code, and so we'll share a read-only link as well, along with some other links. We have a link on the ordinance for phase 1, a link on the ordinance for phase 2. In addition, we also have information on our overview for our webpage detailing information about phase 1 and phase 2, including development standards. And then we have also links on land development code amendments and of course the Appendix Q, which John talked about, and all of the requirements that are in the International Residential Code. In addition to, he mentioned the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulations, and so that also will also include to all of our attendees a link to that webpage on industrialized housing and buildings. Next slide, please. All right, we are now at the portion where we you can go ahead and ask any questions that you might have. If you would like to use the Q&A function of Zoom, I'll remind you all that it is at the bottom of the screen. If you are having trouble locating that, please let us know and we'll help troubleshoot that. It's helpful to use the Q&A function versus the chat because that way we can keep track of the questions that are answered and the questions that we haven't yet gotten to answer. And then I'll remind everyone that we are keeping track of all of our questions and all of the answers, and those will be sent out to our participants and will also be posted in our webpage, which is publicinput.com/DSC info series. So you can also raise your hand using the raise hand control panel, and we'll go ahead and call on you, or using the Q&A function as well. I'll note that there's a few questions that have already been answered. We have folks ask about whether the International Residential Code is available to homeowners. And one of our subject matter experts, John Richards, included a free version that you can find. So there's a link in the Q&A function that you can access to take a look at. And if you want to check out the International Residential Code that talks all about the technical requirements that John overviewed today. So there's a few links that were looked at, and it's read only available for you to take a look at. I will go ahead and open it up for any questions. I don't see any in the chat. The other thing that I'll remind folks is that this presentation was being recorded, and so it will also be available to our attendees, and we will also have it in our public input page. Next slide, please, as we get folks answer questions. As we are going through the questions, if you want to go ahead and let us know how did we do, we do have a post-engagement survey on FormStack to let us know how we can improve your experience. And then there's that public input page that talks about the next and the upcoming info series. All right, we have a question from one of our attendees, and I think this one's for Austin Water. Are there separate sewer and water supply required versus tying to the existing home service? So Raina, I think that's you.
Yes. So at this time, you will be required to have a separate water meter for each dwelling unit because a tiny home is a dwelling unit. You may be able to share the wastewater service line depending on the type, the size, and the condition of the wastewater service line.
Thank you, Raina. Appreciate you. All right, the next question, I don't know, I don't think we have an answer, but John, maybe you can talk about the current requirements. So we had one of our attendees ask if the city of Austin is planning on allowing and approving out-of-state built tiny homes. These are unique and a niche. There may be better options outside the state. Also, if the state allows this, it would still receive its certificate, correct? And so right now, John, currently we're only accepting those who are approved by TD, the Texas state, correct?
Correct. And as far as I know, we are not, or I haven't heard any thing to change the out-of-state option. There are a lot of approved builders outside of the state, but currently the city of Austin just does not accept those, even though they do comply with TLR. But at this time, and from what I've heard, that's not going to change.
All right, thank you for that question and that clarification, John. We do have one attendee who is raising their hand, and so I will go ahead and call on Stuart. Hey, Stuart, welcome. Thank you. What's your question?
My question is there any thought of having a standardized checklist for final inspections for not only tiny homes, but manufactured homes, modular homes, and others, so that all of us who might be involved in securing these for occupancy would know at the end of the process what are all the things that the city inspectors are going to look at?
Gotcha. Great question, Stuart. So the question was if there's plans for a standardized checklist. John, would that be something that we have right now, or maybe Steve?
Yes, we do have a checklist. It's for the plan review side of things. And it's what we look at to approve, the permitting or prior to construction. And I'll post a link to it in the chat. I believe that inspections is very similar. I don't know exactly if they have a checklist. But maybe we can follow up with that one.
Yeah.
But like I said, I'll put the plan review checklist in the chat.
Right. We'll go ahead and get that information, check Stewart, for inspections as well. And thank you, John, for providing that link. That link will also make it available to our attendees. All right, we have a question from our attendees in the Q&A function, and the question is, how are tiny homes labeled under zoning? Is it the same as a 2-unit? Alyssa, would that be you?
It could also be John Richards, but yes, so a tiny home will be labeled as a second unit. Just because of its size is not, as long as it complies with the IRC requirements of a dwelling, it will count as a second unit and be addressed as such.
Thanks, Alyssa. And thank you for that question. All right, the next question that we have from our attendee is, they want to confirm, we have an attendee who wants to confirm that TDLR structure still goes through the residential plan review. Is there any current efforts to streamline the review process, so similar to a mobile home review, and reduce fees? So the first question from that part is confirming that it still goes on residential plan review, and any similarities to the mobile home review. John, would that be you?
Yes, and it does go through plan review. We do have a condensed version that we don't look as in depth to the structural or life safety things that we would on a normal site built home. If you click on the link I provided in the chat for the checklist, there is a section for tiny homes that spells out exactly what we would look at. And it is similar to the mobile home or manufactured home portion. As far as I know, there's not a reduction in fees, as we do still have to go through part of the process. But we do rely on the TDLR review and approval to bypass a lot of the things we normally look at for site built homes.
Gotcha. Thank you, John, for that answer. The next question that we have from an attendee is similar question to the question that was asked for Austin Water. So Raina, I think this might be for you again. If there is capacity on the existing main house panel, are you able to install a sub panel without a separate meter and service?
Good afternoon, everyone. I think this is for this would be Austin
Energy?
Energy, possibly.
Okay,
Yeah,
gotcha.
this sounds like
Thanks, Robert.
this is related to electrical. Hi, everybody. Yeah, this is Robert Rees. Yeah, so to this question here, yes, if the capacity is there for the panel, they can install what they need over there. As far as a separate meter, you're able to install a sub panel without a separate meter. Yes, they would not need a separate meter if they were just using the capacity they have existing to their original home. If they're just adding like a second structure out there.
Gotcha. Thank you, Robert. All right, and the next question that we have is, does this only apply to single family lots, or multifamilies are included as well? John or Alyssa? I think this one might be Alyssa.
So yeah, this would not apply to a multifamily zone lot. It would be single family SF1, 2, or 3.
Okay, gotcha. And in the if y'all want to check out in our public info page, we'll go ahead and post We had a session about home phase 1 where we talk about the different zoning areas as they are in the land development code. So thank you, John, for clarifying that question for our attendee. I'll remind everyone that this session is being recorded, and so you will have an opportunity. You will have an opportunity to go ahead and listen to the recording, and we'll also summarize our questions and answers that we received throughout the session. If you have a question, I'll go ahead and give a few more minutes. If you would like to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function. I'll also remind folks that there's a few questions that have already been answered by our subject matter experts. Folks were asking where to find the International Residential Code. And then we went ahead and answered. There was one question that talked about the square foot of the tiny home. So that was clarified by one of our subject matter experts as well. All right, I don't see any other questions in our all right, so we have one more question. We have one attendee asking whether what are the impervious cover requirements, and I think that portion was covered in will be covered in phase 1 and was covered in phase 2, correct, Alyssa?
Yeah, so impervious cover requirements will be based off of the base zoning, so SF 1, 2, or 3, unless the ordinance states otherwise. So it'll still be 45%, unless you are using the small at single family requirements. But again, that would still be for 1 unit, which we will cover next week.
All right, so with that, I'll go ahead and close it out. We have an upcoming session for building under home for the phase 2. There, as John mentioned in the beginning, there's been several phases for this. And so we covered phase 1 last week. Today, we're talking about technical requirements for tiny homes. And then next week, tune in to talk about and learn more about phase 2. That'll be around the same time, same day, Tuesday, April 29th at 11. Registrations available on publicinput.com/DSC info series. And again, a reminder, let us know how we did. There is on screen the post-engagement survey so that we can make this experience better. Thank you so much for joining us and thank you for your time. We will see you next time. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.